class, it's Danielle.
David.
And Diana again.
As you may have figured out,
we all belong to the Hispanic culture.
David's great-grandparents were born in Mexico.
Danielle's grandparents were also born in Mexico.
And Diana's parents were born in Colombia.
We're all familiar with the basic Hispanic traditions.
Danielle and Diana often go back to Mexico and Colombia to see their family members who still live there.
And honestly, we can imagine our lives without the rich, loud, and spicy culture that surrounded us since birth.
One of Danielle and David's floor mates freshman year brought to their attention that she felt a cultural void when hearing aspects of Mexican culture.
This, along with conversations from our class, is what inspired us to see if in fact there is a white culture.
And if so, what are some examples of it?
Disfruten!
What is white culture?
My dad's family.
Hamburger.
Distant.
Anglo-Germanic.
Spending. Thanksgiving.
3 people.
White people in Hanover?
Privilege.
What is pop culture?
Wasp.
Have never really thought of white as a culture.
I felt a cultural void. Yeah, I talk about this sometimes with people. I'm not Jewish. My family doesn't really have any ethnic ties. I mean, you could say my mom's Australian, but she's really brought nothing with her, anything culturally to sort of stick to. I've heard had to pick and choose.
Coming from, I guess, a white culture, I think that for a lot of, unless you have a really strong national or ethnic identity, I feel like white culture in America, at least in my own experience, has been the absence of I feel like it's the absence of a real culture. My grandmother is only first generation American, and my dad spoke French growing up, and I feel like we could have held on to a lot of our culture, but we didn't, and I feel like I missed out on something. Family get-togethers, and we have traditions, but none of it's really rooted in a national identity.
It definitely, the first days of school, always when people would introduce themselves and go through, oh, I've lived in these 5 different countries, and this is my 7th school that I've lived in, and I speak 4 languages. I was just, well, I'm Colleen, I'm from Houston, lived here my whole life, so.
I'm just kind of white Protestant girl from middle class family. So I just kind of felt like I didn't really have a whole lot of unique stories to tell.
A mix of British and Australian. My mother immigrated from England. I just think I'm not as connected to my heritage as a lot of people are. Groups based on culture are more, make more sense to me than groups based on race. I just don't see that as a dividing factor.
Black culture to me is very distinctly different from African culture in the sense of being African American versus African, because I can't identify who I am from any origin in Africa, and as a result, as being black, I consider my ancestry to just go back to the slaves. To me, black is just what I am. And in America, I think there is a black American identity, because there are a lot of us who don't have any cultural background that we can pull on from Africa. And as a result, that's kind of what bonds us together.
Based on people's personalities, I'd have an easier time pinning them to where within the U.S. they're from, rather than exactly what racial group they're from. Even though that would be visibly obvious a lot of times, based on how people act, I think I would say more depends on exactly where they were raised.
A lot of Southern traditions that are followed there that aren't necessarily followed in a lot of other areas, with food and language and recreation. But then there are also a lot of kind of unique aspects of the area. There's sweet tea, barbecue, cool drinks, and watermelon.
I don't know, I always think of New England as kind of Ivy League-ish, and people have that stereotype of New Englanders. And I feel like Boston especially there's a lot of Irish influence. Like St. Patrick's Day is like a huge holiday in Boston.
Texas is different from the rest of the country, but Houston, since it's a bigger city, not so much. Like I can't really tell the difference between Houston and any other big city in the country. But if you go out into the country in Texas, like one of the big cities, then yeah, it's a lot more. You get the real like southern like culture, I guess.
A debutante ball is sort of like your coming out into society event, and it's really a historical tradition that has just kind of evolved into still being used today, but it doesn't quite mean the same thing as it used to. It used to be the event where you like officially came into society, where you could attend like adult events and when you were officially like eligible to be married. But now that's not really the case because most girls after their freshman year of college, especially the ones I was with, are not getting married immediately. So the historical like implications of it are a little bit different now. But it does kind of symbolize like your kind of growing up and coming into society. The whole event is like very ceremonial, and most debutante balls have like a kind of a week or a part of a week of parties leading up to the actual event. So there will be events with like mothers and daughters, and the girls and their dads or escorts, and so it's kind of a big family affair that your family gets really involved in, and takes a lot of planning and that sort of thing. And then the actual debutante ball is a very like ceremonial event, like I said, and girls get dressed up in really like formal white dresses that usually have like big ball skirts and that sort of thing.
I think it exists as a construction that nobody really wants to be a part of. Nobody's going to say, I don't know who you would find who would say, like, I adhere to the white culture. I think a lot of people use white culture or whiteness as sort of just something to bash. Nobody really wants to be that. I think there are a lot of people who try to appeal to other cultures, and nobody really wants to be white, because to be white is to be the oppressor. And nobody wants to be the bad guy. White culture exists, but it doesn't exist. Nobody wants to be part of it, but somebody's a part of it because we're all like talking about it all the time.
I had never been able to see or really consider culture of whiteness because I was always part of it.
About 60% of the U.S. population identifies themselves as white.
In the United States, being white is considered the norm because it is a dominant culture. Therefore, being white is not often explored because it's all around. As theorists claim, whiteness is defined by what it is not. The legal construction of colored identities is critical to the maintenance of white culture. Culture is not inborn, but rather it is learned and heavily influenced by the environment that one is raised in. In many cases, people grow up in hegemonic environments and are therefore surrounded by people who are of similar backgrounds. Thus, they do not need to learn about their own culture or race. But who is to say that there cannot be a white culture and that people cannot celebrate it? After all, culture is a symbolic representation of how we understand our existence.